ready to achieve great heights? Then you're in the right place. Welcome to Power Your Performance, the podcast where we dive deep with leaders in the gaming world and beyond and learn the techniques they use to power their lives. I am your host, Gary Klingman. Ian Seltzer, welcome to Power Your Performance. Nice to have you.
Thanks for having me, Gary. I appreciate it.
It is literally my pleasure to have an esports strategist, somebody who has an understanding of the emerging market, where it's been, where it is, and where it's going. But before we get into that, as we just talked, and I stare out one of the few days it looks like it's nice to be in New York City. How did it start? Did you want to be in gaming when you were in college? When you were at Penn, right? You were a student, and then what? Fill me in.
Yeah. So I was actually doing my undergraduate work over at Penn, and Gary, to your point, before we dive into it, I think with the view outside, you've kind of hit me on one of those like 2 weeks worth of weather here in New York, where New Yorkers aren't complaining about it being too cold or too hot. So we enjoy, sort of the bliss while it lasts. But
I'm glad we caught you. Life is timing, so it's good timing to catch you.
Absolutely. So I was doing my undergraduate work at Penn. And I think that overall, sort of the thing that attracted me, it was always kind of like disruptive trends within the media world. So I guess this is a good transition to, kind of chat about my career and kind of how it ended up with gaming. But I was always, me and my roommates throughout all of undergrad, we were always like very into gaming and whatnot. We followed the South Korean StarCraft scene, and I'm about to date myself severely on GOM TV and all that fun stuff. And it was always something that, we were probably a little bit too early to the party where, kind of the game that we were very into was Team Fortress 2, which I guess it's, claim to fame aside from being a great game. It's kind of Overwatch before Overwatch. So it was something where esports was still a very niche industry, but I guess for me, seeing a packed arena and, tens of thousands of fans in Asia, it wasn't like the farthest fetched concept to me, having been exposed to that sort of in my late teens and early 20s. So basically, when I was in undergrad, I sort of noticed, and it was in my freshman year, I was living in, kind of one of the dorms was a historically protected, national site. So the university couldn't renovate it in any way, shape, or form. So it was notorious on campus for still having tenement-like conditions from when it was constructed, I believe, in like the 1920s. So basically, we just had internet. There was no cable or anything like that. And sort of the thing that I picked up was that was kind of the golden age, for better or for worse, of sort of piracy and file sharing and that sort of thing. And whether it was myself or my peers, I realized that everyone was consuming content, whether that was film, TV, or music, via streaming. And basically, those were sort of the days where, all of the powers that be within the traditional media world were very keen on slapping lawsuits on, a bunch of 19-year-old college kids, which never really struck me as a bright way to sort of cultivate an audience. And I think for me, what really resonated was sort of that sense of there's a major disconnect in terms of traditional media distribution and how younger audiences were sort of consuming content. It was very much sort of, not only streaming, but the rise of sort of like on demand. And people wanted that convenience of having content available when and wherever they wanted to watch it or consume it in any way. So basically, I viewed sort of piracy as kind of being a little bit of a market externality. And it was something, consumers generally don't want to engage in illegal behavior. It was just sort of something where there was no good framework or distribution mechanism to catch this younger audience. And even if we wanted to pay for, cable or satellite, there was no way that we could get, our sort of, dorm renovated for that. So, that was sort of the logical jumping off point of saying, I think that there's something here behind the streaming business. And basically from there, I was spending my summers interning here in New York City at ABC News' digital division. And basically, just due to my interest in kind of the entertainment world, I fell in with working with Peter Travers over there, the head movie critic at Rolling Stone. Peter was a great guy who really gave me, a lot of free rein for a college intern over there. And basically, one day, and I will preface this by saying that was at the height of my Judd Apatow Freaks and Geeks fandom, we had James Franco and Seth Rogen come in promoting the Pineapple Express. And I happened to be living with my closest friend from growing up, and he was a writer on the Harvard Lampoon. We always had this idea to do web sketches and, just figure out a way that we could sort of use that budding comedy writer talent and kind of get stuff out there into the wild. So I soft pitched Rogan and Franco in the green room and just sort of said like, hey, we want to do these web sketches. Here's our email, feel free to be in touch. No pressure if you're not interested. Never expected to hear back from them. We heard back from Franco that night saying like, hey guys, this sounds awesome. Let's make it happen. So basically my senior year of college, we got an email from Franco's agents basically saying like, hey, he has a break in his shooting schedule up in Boston. He was doing, I believe, Howl at the time. And basically I was finishing up class. I threw my laptop and a couple of changes of clothing and a backpack, sprinted over to 30th Street Station and caught the first Amtrak up to Boston. In one weekend for the cost of rented camera equipment, coffee, and pizza for the cast and crew, we got 3 web sketches in the can. Through Franco's sort of connections, we were able to get that at Funny or Die, and they were our distribution partner for it. So the series went live while I was still wrapping up senior year, and I still vividly remember I had access to analytics tools on my iPhone 2, and I was sort of keeping track of how it was doing. So I remember that our first web sketch, what got posted in Funny or Die, premiered. It was doing pretty well. It got a couple of 1,000 views, which for me being a college student,
that's pretty good. Yeah,
thrilled. That was more than enough for me.
Yeah, something more than one gets your parents excited and say, okay, fine, you can do this.
Exactly, right? It's not just a pipe dream. So from there, basically, I started to see okay, we're starting to see some uptick, some viewership. And it turned out that the sketch had gotten picked up by the Reddit crowd, and it started to get some traction there. So all of a sudden, by the afternoon, that number had ballooned out to 50,000 views. So I'm just like, okay, this is pretty good. One unexpected treat. And then from there, HuffPo picked it up and put it on their homepage. And that's when, the thing really went viral. And basically, by the end of the day, we had cracked a couple of 100,000 views on the web sketch. And over the course of its lifetime, we got over 1.3 million views on the series itself. So that was one of those things that kind of validated of saying hey, the streaming thing that I thought it was a good idea. There's definitely something to this, and there's a business to be had. So that kind of informed my decision. I decided to apply for my master's degree over at the London School of Economics. And it feels crazy to say this, 10 years out. But the whole reason why I went over there and cried me a river for having to live in London for a year while I was doing my master's work was that it was the only program in the world at the time that was offering a comprehensive study of media and communication done from the sociology angle, which is crazy. That's the bare minimum for any comms program in academia nowadays, but that's how it was back then. And basically, I fell in with a group of professors who were doing a lot of work on the purely academic side of streaming media. And I ended up writing my dissertation on monetization models behind premium video content in the US. And at the time, that was really only Netflix, where streaming was still just a value add that they had in addition to their mail order DVD business. And then Hulu was sort of out there way back when. So I guess it was one of those rare times of having done that and said like, hey, there's something interesting in the water that's going to happen in Hollywood. Being in my early 20s was one of those rare times where you kind of pick up and move anywhere in the world with a suitcase. New York was always sort of home to me by nature of growing up in the area and having family here. So I figured, hey, I'm gonna give LA a shot. It seems like, it's that industry is pretty ripe for disruption out there. So I showed up over there and basically kind of, I was fortunate enough that the guys I knew over at Funny or Die tossed me a bone and gave me an internship on their marketing and biz dev team as I was sort of getting settled in LA. But my first break actually came at a talent management firm. It was just an amazing way of, starting off in the mailroom there and really cutting my teeth in traditional Hollywood. I focused in on like IP and licensing. The firm that I was at, worked on optioning and selling Game of Thrones to HBO. It was a fascinating time to be there. So basically, through there, I sort of had my crash course in how traditional Hollywood sort of worked. All kind of the stakeholders and just the broad strokes of it. From there, I ended up at Paramount's digital division over there. We were one of the first subsets of Hollywood that was essentially working on, original web series over there. One of my favorite projects I worked on in my career was we had a output deal with Ben Stiller's production company, Red Hour. So we worked on a show called Burning Love that was actually a mock of The Bachelor and Bachelorette type shows. And basically it premiered on Yahoo abroad. And due to how successful it was, NBC Universal picked it up for a run on linear television here in the US. And it was one of the first examples of, a web series premiering abroad and then being repurposed for television, which is kind of now, as we can all attest to, one of the main business models of the content industry. So it was just awesome to be there, sort of on the front lines of kind of like the Wild West days of streaming. But I think that the unfortunate thing was that we were probably a little bit too early to the party over there. And timing is everything, as you said earlier, Gary. So basically, the studio had no idea what we were doing. They were sort of looking at us as a traditional sort of like subset of motion picture marketing. And we were running at like a lean and mean startup. So they kind of scratched our heads and didn't get it. So unfortunately, the division didn't survive. But for me, I was pretty young at the time. And basically, I got scooped up onto the content team by Hulu. We had done one of their first original web series called The Booth at the End. And basically from there, for me, it was a dream come true, having written my dissertation on them. I thought that they were up to doing really interesting things, and to kind of be there during like the early days when, it was a real startup. We showed up to our little schlubby offices in Santa Monica, with jeans, sneakers, and a button down. I was probably the nicest dressed guy.
Yeah, I would think so.
Yeah, most of our staff were devs or coders who were really just like next level people. But it was like your very stereotypical sort of like West Coast startup thing of like you'd show up. And it would be people doing keg stands at like 10 a.m. or whatnot, and we'd be sitting there in the content team just like we have a day of work here. To each their own. But it was an awesome experience. It was just very fascinating to be there. We were in charge of all licensing for the company. We launched, their originals team, which, now goes on to win Emmys. We just like couldn't be prouder of the work that we had over there. And basically, we were over there and it was just like such an unbelievable experience to sort of be there firsthand. And the company was rapidly evolving. We had a liquidity event, and I think that, our media owners coming from that sort of very traditional world sort of called it and said like, hey, it's time for the company to sort of button up and go from being, in the angry teenager phase of a startup to being, a little bit more mature. And that was fine. That was where the company needed to go, but not quite my cup of tea. So I ended up at Michael Eisner's digital studio that was called Boogaroo. We were focused on web first content over there. So kind of, if I were to sum up in a nutshell, it was kind of Quibi before Quibi, and a little bit more successful than Quibi. I will add.
Who wasn't? I mean, that's got to be the biggest failure in the history of media.
Yeah, I mean, it's once again, timing is everything, right? And it's to be launching kind of that mobile first content, business. And then all of a sudden COVID hits and everyone is stuck at home for the better part of a year. Not much that you can do to sort of fight the tape on that one. But fortunately, we were well before all of that. But anyways, it was a great experience over there, and basically the opportunity to sort of work with Michael, and he brought a lot of his lieutenants from the Disney company over there. Specifically, the guys who I was pretty close with were in charge of building out Disney's parks business abroad. And also, a lot of folks were kind of instrumental in setting up the business model for ESPN, and just the way that those folks looked at the media business. It was a true learning experience. I'm just so fortunate to have. It was a completely unique way of looking at IP and sort of figuring out new ways to monetize and repurpose content to sort of resonate with new platforms and for younger audiences. So I think, that has sort of done me really well, as things kind of went into the esports and sort of gaming world. But, kind of long story short, I had a great run out there, for the first 5 years of my career. And it was just really unbelievable in terms of luck and timing to just kind of be there in the front lines of sort of, like the early days of streaming, that sort of first wave over there. But at least for me, New York was always sort of pulling me back. And like I mentioned earlier, it's home, and it happened to be a media capital of the world. So I was fortunate enough that I wasn't looking at torpedoing my career in any way, shape, or form. And sort of the game plan when I got back was I just figured, hey, I'm going to end up just working for, for a big media company here in New York, and that's probably going to be my career and whatever. But, I guess life had other plans, and I couldn't be happier with how things worked out. So basically, as I was still unboxing my stuff from LA, I had a couple of contacts within the early stage investor community here in New York. And basically, there was a company coming in that was pitching video game slot machines called Game Cup. And basically a couple of investors tapped me and just said, hey, would you mind coming in and sitting in with us for this meeting? We don't know anything about video games, and we don't know anything about slot machines and gambling. So I said, sure, why not? And as I mentioned earlier, gaming had always been a big part of my life, whether it was growing up or sort of, seeing the early days of esports in college. So I was just really excited to kind of, look into that world and see what was going on. So it actually ended up being a really fascinating company that we invested in the seed round for. And all of a sudden, I found myself working as an early stage investor. Our firm is called Pierce Yates Ventures, and we focus on seed stage companies and sort of the esports, media, sports, and fintech ecosystems here in New York. So at least for me, from there, we started looking at and saying, hey, if you're going to deploy capital into the traditional sports world, you're going to have to cut ridiculously large checks that will probably have little to no impact that you can measure over there. And it sort of seemed like esports was kind of the early days where you can make a material impact.
So you're sitting at the VC and basically you're analyzing the opportunity, right, in terms of, do we deploy capital into what is a relatively new and unproven vertical, right, in terms of monetization. I think it was proven in terms of engagement because people have been gaming in large numbers for quite some time. Twitch obviously brought that from a streaming, which is your background, into kind of the real world and saying now it's viable and it's acceptable. But as a VC looking at an esports organization, what are the top 2 or 3 things you're saying this is what they have to have for us to want to deploy any capital?
Yeah, I think for us, we were sort of looking at it, and once again, this was sort of the early days of esports. So it's basically, as we were sort of looking at it, I would say that the things that, kind of moved the needle for us as a team, and sort of looking at the pro team investment side of things, it was what was an identifiable brand what were the video game titles that they were active in. And at the time, that was around when Blizzard was about to launch Overwatch League. So that was sort of top of everyone's mind. And then we really just wanted to have founders that were willing to hustle and, had a vision that they wanted to execute against. So basically, at least for me, in terms of mapping out a little bit of the transition there, to your point earlier, Gary, there was something that stood out to me about the content business here. And it seemed like streaming in Hollywood was just getting a little bit stagnant, where it was just, you were kind of rehashing the old business model of television, which it works. It's enormously profitable, as we can attest to today with everyone launching their own, every media company on the planet launching their own owned and operated streaming platform during the pandemic. But for me, it just kind of seemed like more than the same. And, once then back to the theme of sort of disruption in the media world, what really kind of moved the needle for me with esports as kind of being an area of interest was that it was the first subset of the media world where, as you mentioned earlier, with specifically with Twitch, where it was VOD streaming content was the bare bones minimum exception from a millennial audience. It wasn't just some luxury like it was out in Hollywood. So at least for me, that's what really kind of raised my eyebrows on it. And then I was fortunate enough that before I moved back from LA, I had a couple of roommates who were sort of working in the local sort of media startup world and had some ties into the esports world. So one weekend we were sitting around, it was like a Sunday, I believe, and they were just like, hey, we have an extra ticket to the Major League Gaming Finals in Anaheim at the Honda Center. Do you want to go? And I just said, like, yeah, sure. Why not? Always been interested in it. Could be a fun experience. And I showed up and it was like 12,000 fans just going completely nuts. And they had driven that on just grassroots marketing alone. And I was just like, whoa, even with just like, a huge television sized marketing budget, at Hulu, I can only drive a fraction of these eyeballs, and these people are doing it for a live event. Like, this is crazy.
It was great.
So,
I think we've all, everyone I know that has been in gaming in some form or another had that eye-opening experience where you actually went to an arena. Mine was the Oakland Coliseum. And if I closed my eyes, I was at an NBA game, screaming and yelling, moms and kids, dads and kids, buying merch. And it's just massive video screens and teams competing against each other in a game that I certainly did not follow, and I didn't understand why anybody was screaming at any given time. But the atmosphere was just mind-boggling over a game. And the interesting thing is, it is that, but does that make it a business?
Yeah,
and I think somewhere in there, there's a phrase I use frequently. It's easy to find a gap in the market. It is not so easy to find the market in the gap, and I just wonder if even the excitement in these arenas, is there a market there? I know there's a gap because 12,000 people are going and they're sharing it and it's multi-generational. But is that a sustainable business? I had a conversation with somebody yesterday, and another investor in this space, and they only invest in peripherals in and around gaming and not in gaming itself. And I think, so with your background, getting back to, your journey, where is that opportunity? And how do you identify it? What do you do to test it? Because there's so many people, and I know the people that, when we look at Power Your Performance, part of the performance we look at is not just gaming performance, but financial performance, investment performance, community, and what have you. Where is that?
Absolutely. And, I think I'll give you, kind of a multi-part answer to the question here, and a little bit of we'll dabble in kind of various experiences within the esports world. So, the pro team that we ended up investing in and led their seed round was called Rogue. And basically I got to know the co-founder and CEO through the due diligence process, and they sort of got to know my background and hired me off to be their first commercial employee, and just head up, building our content studio. And essentially, being a startup, I was a man of many hats. So, being in charge of merch, partnerships, you name it, it was a biz dev thing that fell on my plate. And essentially, you'll get a kick out of this. I started over there when I was like 29, going on 30. And the team is headquartered out in Las Vegas. So I would actually, even though I was still living in New York, I would spend a lot of time traveling and working out there at the team frat house, for lack of a better term. And at, age 29, I was the oldest guy there, yes, by like a solid 6-7 years. And I remember every time that I would show up, they would be like, Uncle Ian is here. And I'd be like, oh, come on, guys. Can it be your cool older brother from New York that comes back with really awesome vinyl for you guys? And they're like, you just said vinyl, Uncle Ian. It was just like, oh no, so that stopped. But it was really just a fascinating experience to kind of see that world firsthand. And I think that, being there on the front lines, we were fortunate enough with the team and everyone there that the company was acquired, a year and a half later. So I think that we missed out on a lot of the sort of growing pains over there. And I flip back onto the investor side. But yeah, I think that there's sort of been, and I experienced this especially when I was working for the team, that there was sort of, a couple of phases. I think that you can go in with the evolution of sort of esports and revenues, and kind of there's been a big disconnect between private markets and sort of the enthusiasm and FOMO of the investment community. And as you said, what are real tangible revenues here? And I think that sort of, the first phase was sort of part of the ad sales world, where it kind of became, you had a lot of pro teams sort of get, whether it was major investment backing or a cross-pollination of traditional sports owners. I think your ones that come to mind would be, Jerry Jones buying Complexity and whatnot.
Yeah, Bob Kraft in Boston,
and,
right?
The list goes on. But I think with their, that was sort of round one of saying how can we have an audience grab to sort of enhance our traditional media sports properties. So that sort of happened, and that became a scramble of just, okay, how do we sort of monetize this? So I think that the first phase in terms of trying to do that was really on the ad sales and marketing side of things. So you kind of saw just really, really big and perhaps unjustified sort of, deals that were being cut between major sponsors and esports teams. I think specifically were the real culprits here. I think the professional leagues, did a better job at executing against this. But basically, I feel like on the corporate side of things for big media buyers here in New York, it sort of hit that point where it was just, we need a younger audience. And what's sort of that number of, total viewers that we could throw on a PowerPoint slide that gets presented to top brass in our C-suite here once a quarter to just show that we're involved with an esports world, and that we have a younger audience or whatnot. And that's fine. I think that worked for about a year or two. But all of a sudden, sponsors started to say well, what's my tangible ROI on this? What am I getting? And I think that the answer from a lot of folks, in particular the team side of things, was the
conversion is not there.
Yeah, that was pretty lacking. I think the part of it, I think that, it's every entrepreneur has their respective journey. A lot of these pro teams, with the exception of your Team Liquids, your Cloud9s, which are legacy businesses, let's be very clear, that have been around for, nearly 2+ decades at this point. So let's cut those guys out. But a lot of the teams, it's kind of, they've been run as startups. They tend to be gamers, at its core, which is great. That's what you need. But the biz staff tends to be pretty, slim, and it tends to be folks who their only experience has been in the world of video games and esports. And there's always been a lack of sort of, basic business fluency within the space. And that's stuff that, it's high tuition in the school of life. It's difficult to sort of teach that, to a 20-year-old who's stuck, who gets just put in charge of doing a partnership of Allstate while they're working at an esports team. So, those sort of things, you can make it last for, a year or two tops, but it's only a matter of time before, brands and agencies start to wake up and say, like, well, what are we getting out of this? There are a couple of notable exceptions to the rule. I loved and I think that the connective tissue there is that there are folks that have really understood kind of the gaming community and doing things that are unique and really resonate with gamers and have that sort of tongue-in-cheek understanding of the community that they're trying to advertise to. So one of my favorites, it was for Arby's, and they did an activation for CSGO, which, is a first-person shooter. So they took a couple of top players over there and they actually brought them to a shooting range where they had them target, Arby's roast beef sandwiches. And it was just kind of like, see what happens. And, like to this day, it remains one of my favorite activations within the space. And it went it was really successful for the community. You had a lot of people sharing it and it made sense. It was a lot of fun. It kind of understood, they understood the audience that they were trying to market to over there. But I think that those are unfortunately sort of, few and far between. So
well, but that's content. I mean, that's not necessarily the esport. I mean, it is a content play, as opposed to the gameplay, so to speak. And esports is certainly built on gameplay and competition. Now, if you look at all the top organizations, they now look at themselves and they call themselves an entertainment media company more than a gaming company, and they're producing content. Now, I don't know if that's successful or not. I mean, you can look at FaZe Clan and their $1 billion merger on it with a SPAC that was kind of put on hold because numbers didn't get to where they should get. And I think in the last couple of days, they announced a collaboration with producing content with Disney for 12 months. And you go, okay, well, that's kind of an interesting content play. So what is the future from, you've seen it historically. Where does esports, gaming, I look at completely different. The 3 billion people that game every day, the bulk of that are just people casually or competitively playing with their friends. But esports, which gets all the attention or most of the attention, where's it going?
Yeah, so I think with that one, it's kind of a little bit of a mix, right? If we're to go into, sort of what's the second phase of, kind of esports missing the mark, where, we're in a much more evolutionary than revolutionary phase of the business. To your point, I would certainly say, once kind of a little bit of sort of the ruse, for lack of a better term, of ad sales and marketing kind of let up and people got wise, to sort of failings on that side. It became, sort of the next buzzword that I saw was content, and that's, as you said, everyone was kind of branding themselves as a media business. And you guys heard my background earlier. I just didn't see it. Once again, you were kind of marketing to an audience that fundamentally they don't watch long form content. They don't like content, bizarrely enough, it's very well produced or too slick or anything like that. I think that's kind of just by nature of growing up on Twitch and UGC. So basically from there, it's sort of that ability to have a fully fledged licensing strategy that, works with Windows in the US and abroad, that gets tossed out the window immediately. And then fundamentally, I think that you're dealing with a generation that has grown up predisposition to not paying for content, and beyond that, not having advertisers, against that content unless they're being integrated into it. So I think that was kind of like the next sort of, that was phase two of revenues trying to work itself out. And that during the pandemic, I would say that sort of let up of folks kind of saw wasn't really working out. And then from there, I think that, Web3 of all things, sort of NFTs and whatnot was kind of the next phase we're sort of in now, of people trying to make sense of that area. And only time will tell. I think it's just such early innings. There's obviously a lot of promise. We're very bullish about certain applications, particularly from the platform side of things. but we've yet to see that trickle down into kind of the esports space. But I think that, that the thing that's overall, that's kind of like, been top of mind for me as an investor over the past couple of years has been that so much of the esports world, in terms of looking at new startups and businesses, you're reliant on IP that's coming from one of the major video game publishers. And there's only so much latitude that you have to do things and create a sustainable business model before the publisher either A, shuts you down or just comes knocking on your front door saying like, hey, we want to cut. There's been a lot of talk about sort of developing the next great game that could live outside of the publishers and whatnot, which I think interesting things can happen in the indie video game community. Absolutely, no question. That's a little bit of an externality. Play to earn will have its place within the ecosystem. TBD. I don't think it's going to be the be all end all. But when you chat about, games are coming from the major publishers, which you could count on a single hand, most of them being based in Southern California, it really is, it's eerily reminiscent of the tentpole model in traditional Hollywood, where you're dealing with games that have bankable, recognizable IP, development cycles that last for years, have hundreds of millions of dollars spent against, game development and a marketing budget itself. So, you have every iteration of, the latest Call of Duty, for example, coming out. And, it's really kind of hard to break away from that. So basically what I've kind of focused in on are what are startups within the esports and video game community that are complementary to publishers and their marketing efforts and in audience engagement and cultivation over there, and don't cannibalize their existing business. So if you're
but their existing business, interestingly enough, and maybe it's a natural progression in business, is there's a lot of consolidation happening in gaming. I mean, the Activision Blizzard, Take-Two, and Zynga. There's just a whole lot of that. So it's kind of interesting. I do agree with you. I think the independent game market will explode because the tools are readily available for game developers to create games without the publisher. And there's plenty of distribution channels for them to try to light a fire in a community, which is kind of interesting. But a lot of that to me says the growth of gaming is unlimited, where the growth of esports may not be unlimited. We talked earlier before we started our conversation of a public company that we both know, which I will not name for intentionally, that they announced today taking a $36 million hit on their esports entities because, quote unquote, there was no liquidity in the esports entities. When that happens today on the top of newsletters, that's got to impact investment in the space. I mean, $36 million hit, I don't care who you are, whether you're Jerry Jones or not, that's a big number. And does that have, does that splatter go so deep that it curtails investment? Then if you look at current economics in the country with inflation, and VCs are saying, hey, entrepreneurs, you better tighten your belt because there's less money for us. Where does all that go in gaming?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for the gaming side of things, right, whether it's gaming or esports, there's a certain amount of this where the genie is out of the bottle, the toothpaste is out of the tube, whatever you want to say about it. There's been a consumer behavior, certainly within the media and content business, that, there's a displayed interest in that. So, with the economy sort of, heading in the unfortunate direction that it seems like it is, yes, I think folks are going to have to tighten up their bootstraps. A lot of the sort of fat is going to go away, for better or for worse. And I think that'll serve as a big sort of market correction of what's sort of real and tangible versus things that were a little bit more flimsy on the business model side of things. But I don't think that it's like, the esports of, wanting to be involved in watching pros at the highest level compete within video games. I don't think that the fundamental act of seeing that is just going to disappear off the face of the earth. And certainly, in a world where we're starting to, dare I say, knock on wood, come out of the pandemic and sort of think about what things look like post-COVID, gaming is certainly only rising as kind of, the fastest growing subset of the entertainment world. So at least for us, I think that there are a couple of areas that are going to be really interesting. And I think that, the primary is trying to think about things. And once again, this comes with a big caveat of sort of assuming that things can be done safely with COVID, and any future variants that the world might have to toss at us, or, whatever's the next thing, monkeypox or whatever nightmare the world has to throw our way, that we can still get together in person and convene safely. It's sort of events that or any sort of business for that matter, that can kind of bridge the physical and the digital world. I can walk you through a couple more tangible examples here of companies we've invested in or ones I've advised for that I think do a pretty good job of this. So I think that one, if we're to talk about, kind of marketing and advertising and things that kind of, act as being complementary to your big video game studios, esports leagues, teams, and whatnot, we invested in a company called Gameway. And they're essentially doing sort of boil their business model down to one sentence, luxury video game lounges at airports, which is something that if you kind of think about younger generations and sort of where their interests lie, that's, kind of a home run. And as we think about it, it's something that a publisher would kind of look at that and say like, hey, that's interesting. They're captive. They're, capturing a young audience at an airport. Right. Like no marketing budget that we would spend would even touch, an airport. So like, great, like that's fantastic. Let's figure out a way to work with these guys. I think that other areas that could be really interesting are kind of like within esports and gaming. Of course, I have to say it, but it's going to be esports betting. I think that we're, a ways off on that. And we've invested pretty deeply in sports gambling here in the US. And I think the way to think about that strategically is that we're not even at the point here in the US market where sports gambling is across the line and ready to go in all of the states and has a regulatory and compliance framework set up for that. So it's going to be two things need to happen. First, sports gambling needs to be figured out across the board here. Then iGaming and virtual casinos is going to be next up. And then you have esports. But you better believe that when that gets here, even though maybe a few years out, that will be a big thing, and that's something that, particularly for esports on we're at the top tier pro and team side of things, that is a big sort of, area that a lot of folks are chasing. And I think that, esports startups that do a lot of work in terms of capturing data and, packaging it up in a nice, neat way to existing sports books or ones that specialize in esports. That's an area that, continues to be really interesting for me, even though it may be a little bit out. I think that player performance through a hard data and analytics side of things could be another really interesting area. I advise for a company called Champria. They do just that for Overwatch players. And, that's something that, I only see that area of the market continuing to grow. And as you think about people competing, it's only logical that, you see everyone, if I go for a run out here in the park, everyone's wearing their Fitbit, tracking their performance for that. There's no reason to think why it wouldn't sort of bleed over into the esports world. It's an area where people are sort of spending so much time and effort. Those sort of tools seem like an area that's pretty ripe to grow. And once again, something that falls outside the realm of expertise of a video game publisher. I think that another area that could be interesting in terms of thinking about that sort of, transition from physical or digital to physical, I should say, is thinking about e-commerce and how that could be leveraged and sort of thinking about transition and kind of conversion of customers over there. A company I advise for that's doing just that is called Kudos Labs. They're based in Berlin and Stockholm, and they basically function as, kind of think about it as rewards points for gamers and sort of, setting up a network of, retailers that are in partnership with them, and that ability to take a gamer that has only experienced a brand in a sort of digital realm, and convert them into saying, that they're walking down the street and saying like, oh, hey, that's cool. Like I have some reward points that I can spend, at this, let's just say for argument's sake, at this McDonald's. Like, great, I'll go in there and do it. So I think that's, another area that could certainly be interesting. And then I think that, another area that I see growing pretty rapidly would be the player wellness and nutrition space. And it's something I could vouch for, certainly in my side of the pro team. It's everybody looks at esports pro players and they go like, oh, those guys can play for like 20, 30 years. And it's just like, no, absolutely wrong. They're on football linebacker time. And there's yet to be, just due to spending 20 plus hours a day staring at a screen, practicing, grinding away. And that's just kind of what it takes. It's comparable to, a professional athlete. And basically, I think that you see a lot of burnout over there, and just cognitive abilities going way downhill by the time the folks hit their late 20s, and there's not really a good safety net within the
yeah, I mean, that's certainly the space that Skins plays in some of the products that we are actually coming out with. And there are several ingredient manufacturers that really are focused on ingredients like cognizin that are great for brain health and speed and accuracy, and overall body wellness, including some eye products to improve not only vision, which they say they can, but to reduce blue light and what have you. And I think as that becomes more readily accessible and understandable by education, it will be a daily regimen for gamers. So in the interest of time, I know that we have a whole list of things that I'm going to follow to see if your prognosis of gaming is going to be accurate, and some of these things do come to light. I appreciate the time, the insight, the education, and the knowledge. And I'm sure we will continue this conversation again. Ian, I appreciate the time, dude.
Hey, my pleasure, Gary. Thanks so much for having me.
All right, now go back and enjoy the weather for the 3 days that it's going to last. All right, take care. Thanks, Ian. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening. This podcast is part of the MAP Esports Podcast Network and produced by Innovation Media Enterprises. Please be sure to leave us a review and follow us on your favorite podcast player.